What I'm going to talk today about is mostly illusory memories, which Kathleen said. Again, I'm also at Washington University in St. Louis. But before I do that, because this is a conference about time and not about illusory memories, I thought I would say a word or two about time. And we've been hearing a lot about it, but I'm going to try to take a slightly different tact. Sean Carroll said that when he went out on the street and asked people what they thought about time, and what I'm going to tell you about is what two linguists, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's a philosopher, did. They suggested that people don't have an explicit theory of time, but they have an implicit theory of time. And the way to do that is to analyze how people use time in language. And I've been listening here, and everybody here seems to buy into this metaphor. Lakoff and Johnson wrote a book called Metaphors We Live By, and they pointed out that abstract concepts like time, the mind abhors abstract concepts. That's why we always try to make them concrete. And there's a common expression in English, time is money, but they argued that this really wasn't just an expression. This really is the way people think about time. And they analyzed people's language and came up with a number of expressions that indicate that what we have done is to take over and borrow metaphorically lots of expressions that we use about money and have put them into the time realm. So we say we spend time, just like we spend money, we can spend time on a project, we can invest time in writing a book, we can lose time because our car broke down, an interesting concept, just like you lose money in the stock market, you can lose time. You can waste time, just like you can waste money. You can, a concept I particularly like is found time. If I'd gotten sick this morning and couldn't talk, you would all have half an hour of found time. Like you find money on the street, you can find time when some meeting gets canceled. And we have spare time, like we have spare change. That's another common expression. And even Julian Barber in his talk yesterday about how time doesn't exist commented that he was running out of time. And so will I if I don't get going. But it does lead to the interesting question of how we run out of something that doesn't exist. Now, okay, that's almost all I have to say about time, except to repeat what Kathleen said, that in the mind, time can flow forwards and backwards, that we can remember our past, we can envision our future, we do both all the time. I suspect the older we get, the more we live in the past. Now we know that envisioning the future is fraught with error. If I ask you to think about your airplane ride back to your home, wherever that is, you can do that. You may get delayed, you may not get delayed, you may get a good seat, you may get a bad seat. And we all know that thinking about the future is fraught with all kinds of problems. The other issue, though, as Kathleen alluded to, is that so is thinking about the past. That we know when we're thinking about the future, we're making stuff up. Unfortunately, when we think we're remembering the past, although we are often quite right, we can also be quite wrong because remembering is a constructive process, just as is envisioning the future. So another issue I'm interested in is a jargony word called metacognition, and this refers to as I can measure the accuracy of someone in remembering the past, I can also measure some other quality, say their confidence. We all can say how confident we are in our memories. It's an interesting separate judgment. So we can remember something and then we can give people a confidence rating about that. So my apologies to colleagues from Australia, but if you ask US college students, what's the capital of Australia, to give you one example, they reply Sydney. It's a very high probability that they produce Sydney. And also, if you ask them for a confidence rating, say on a 4-point scale where 4 is highly confident, 3 is pretty sure, and so forth, 1 is just guessing, they usually give a 3 or a 4. They're pretty confident that Sydney is the capital of Australia, which of course it isn't. Canberra is. And so what I'm interested in, but on a personal level, is this kind of high confidence error that people make, except I won't be asking about the capital of Australia, I'll be asking about experiences people have actually had and know about. Now this whole idea that our memory can play tricks on us like this is not one that sits well with a lot of people, and we'll see there's big controversy about it. The idea is if I distinctly remember something, if I have this high confidence feeling about my memory, then surely it must be true. And as if I had longer, I would show you more of these examples. But one way I try to disabuse people of this belief that their cognitive processes are keeping them in perfect touch with the world around them is by pointing to various visual illusions. So here, for all of us looking at this, it looks like the surface of these two apparent boxes seem to be of quite different shape. This is an illusion that Roger Shepard, a psychologist, discovered some time ago, and it's much studied. The box on the left looks to be more or less rectangular. It's longer and narrower. The one on the right looks to be more square, not exactly square. But in fact, and you can go Google this and convince yourself, and I'll try to convince you now, the two colored surfaces, the two orange surfaces, are exactly congruent. They are exactly the same. This illusion is created by the surrounding context. I'll try to show you this. Here's this yellow thing that's not going to change in size. And it fits perfectly. So it's a trick of your eyes that are playing, or actually your perceptual systems, playing on you that shows these to be different. So if something is, you can make an error of something that's sitting right before your eyes, surely you can make an error on something that's disappeared. Now you're asked to recall it or recognize it a week or a month later. So much for a little interlude in visual perception to visual illusions, and I'll talk about memory illusions. Now the consequences of memory illusions, I think we have them all the time, that we're always suffering false memories one way or another. Mike Russell yesterday told a story about how he tells people that when he meets at a party that he's interested in studying the origins of life, and then they see him a few months later say, oh, you're the one who's interested in the Big Bang. Well, okay, that's a false memory. You can kind of see how it happens, as he mentioned yesterday. But it's an error, but it's a harmless one. But there are many types of false memories. The ones I'm especially interested in and working on are ones that have implications for courtroom testimony. And in the United States, there's something called the Innocence Project that is going on. It's led by Barry Scheck. Well, I can't point, but the third from the left, second from the right here, with his hand on the, this man has, the black man in the picture has just been exonerated for a rape that he spent half of his life in prison for, which he didn't commit. In the late 1990s, DNA evidence came in, and some crimes still have DNA evidence around, and so the Innocence Project is trying to extricate people from prison who they believe are innocent, and this was the 12th convict exonerated by DNA just in Dallas. And so this has been a huge project. If you look at the Innocence Project, here are the number of DNA convictions that were, DNA exonerations since the DNA evidence first came in the late 1980s. And now there's something like 272 exonerations based on DNA evidence. And when they've gone back, Janet Reno, when she was Attorney General of the United States, ordered and many of these people who were exonerated, by the way, were on death row. They'd been convicted of a capital offense in the United States and been sentenced to death. And they were awaiting that sentence on death row, and they were exonerated. And this has caused many states in the U.S. to get rid of the death penalty, which most of the rest of the world already has. But Brandon Garrett, a law professor at the University of Virginia, analyzed the first 250 of these cases and asked, what was their basis? How did the people get erroneously convicted? And the answer was essentially eyewitness testimony that was erroneous. People who had been accused of a crime, convicted of a crime based on eyewitness testimony that turned out obviously to be an error. The witness might have been making their best claim and believed everything they said, but they were still wrong. And so this shows the kind of false memories that really are of critical societal importance, and a number of psychologists are working on this issue. How do people have such strong but erroneous memories? And the common assumption is in both lay people and in certainly the US legal system is that confidence and accuracy are highly related. And I'm not going to go through this whole thing, but the basic idea is that people believe this is a theory of memory that is half right, which Several people have said the most dangerous ideas are those that are half right. This one is half right. The basic idea is that experiences leave memory traces, or engrams as they're called. These engrams, or traces, vary in strength, and that trace strength determines both confidence and accuracy. That confidence and accuracy are thought to reflect the same underlying entity. And that, I believe, is a mistake, that the strength of the memory and the amount of confidence one has in it, as we will see, are separable entities. They don't have the same, necessarily have the same fundamental basis. So in experimental settings of the kind I do experiments in laboratories, bringing people in, giving them things to remember and testing them either immediately or after a day or a week or 2 weeks. So we can determine in their laboratory settings what really happened and what didn't happen. But of course, in the outside world, in legal settings, all we know is a witness's confidence. The witness can be very confident or not so confident, and that's all the legal system has to work with. So the assumption the legal system has made is there is this tight correlation, so we can judge a person's accuracy by their confidence. But what if sometimes we find situations where confidence is high, but accuracy is low? And in my research, that's one of the things I look for, is ways in which people can be fooled into believing they're remembering something where really their accuracy is low, but nonetheless their confidence is high. And we've probably got 5 or 6 techniques that do that. I'm not going to be able to talk about many of them today. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 1972 in an eyewitness testimony case that confidence and accuracy, or they called it certainty, not confidence, but certainty, a person's certainty in their memory is a critical criterion to judge the veracity of a witness. In this particular case, the quote I have there is what the witness had said. There was just something that I don't think I could ever forget about that individual, his face. And so he was convicted on having that. The Supreme Court said that when someone says something like that, you can certainly believe them. And they upheld the conviction of this particular person. On the other hand, social and cognitive psychologists have studied confidence and memory, and they've been a bit more all over the place about it. 2 eminent cognitive psychologists recently wrote a book in which they had this quote: the relative accuracy of people's confidence is high. High confidence ratings almost inevitably mean that something, an item, or an event had been presented previously. Low ratings correlate very well with the item being new. On the other hand, here are 3 social psychologists writing some years ago. Confidence is neither a useful predictor of accuracy of a particular witness or of the accuracy of particular statements made by the same witness. And Gary Wells, another social psychologist, this is a quote from the New York Times: there's little to no relationship between the accuracy of witness identification and his or her confidence in it. Well, what are we to make of all this? I'm just finishing writing with John Wickstead at the University of California at San Diego, a paper trying to sort all of this mess out. Who's right about confidence in memory? What does it mean? And the bottom line is, which I'm going to just try to paint a very brief description of today, is that everybody turns out to be right, meaning you can do experiments that show a high correlation between confidence and accuracy, and you can do experiments that show a low correlation. But that means everybody's partly wrong too, that the situation, the bottom line that I'll be getting to is you're not justified in making a blanket statement of this sort, because it depends on too many other factors. So here's one problem. People are doing analyses of very different situations and then drawing sweeping conclusions about them. Let me not go through all 4 of these, but just mention a couple. These are 4 different ways of asking about confidence and accuracy. Take the first one. Suppose we do an experiment and we manipulate an independent variable. Suppose we have them study pictures, and one group of people studies pictures 1 second at a time, another group for 10 seconds at a time. Well, when you do this kind of experiment, confidence and accuracy are always highly correlated. I don't know of any exceptions. The people who study for 10 seconds are more accurate than the people who study for 1 second. They're more confident. But for some of these other types of experiments that are implied here, the confidence-accuracy relationship can be very low to non-existent. So the point I have at the bottom is if you ask the question, and these are just 4 ways, you can actually have hybrid ways of asking these questions. And there have been, by some estimates, about 1,000 experiments asking these questions one way or another. Wickstead and I are combing through trying to make sense of this literature. But the problem is the way you ask this question helps determine what answer you get. You can get no relation whatsoever between confidence and accuracy or a high correlation. So again, the problem in legal settings, though, if we were going to give advice to courts, in legal settings, only confidence is known. I mean, the whole idea, the whole reason you're in the court of law is to try to determine the accuracy of the witness. So the problem is that confidence can be affected by many other factors except the strength of the memory trace, which is what the courts and what many of us would hope to believe, but unfortunately it's just not true. So the critical question is, what are the factors that lead to these high confidence false memories? And let me just talk about one. There are actually a whole lot, but for purpose today, consider the problem of similarity. Robert Buckhout wrote a very influential article in 1974 and appeared in Scientific American. And he drew attention to cases of 3 men. This man, Lawrence Burson, was arrested in New York City for a rape. He was identified in the lineup by the woman he allegedly raped. She said, yes, that's the man who did it. I'll never forget that face. Hold that in mind for a moment. Meantime, about the same time, also in New York City, George Morales, so here on the right, was convicted of a robbery. Again, the same thing. A witness saw him commit the robbery. She picked him out of the lineup. He was convicted of the robbery. Now, sometime later, while both Burson and Morales were still in prison, a third man, Richard Carbone, was arrested in yet a third crime. And while the police had him, he was caught in the act. It was not an eyewitness testimony case. But while he was confessing to past crimes, he confessed to the rape that Lawrence Burson had been arrested and convicted for, and he was also confessed to the robbery that George Morales had been arrested and convicted for. And now you look at these 3 men, and you kind of wonder if everybody in New York in the early 70s kind of looked like this. But you can see, well, that is plausible. You can see how Burson and Morales could be mistaken for Carbone. But nonetheless, this problem of similarity is a huge one. And the way lineups are typically arranged, usually you have a verbal description of the person. So if the verbal description says it's a 5'8" white male, then all the people who has glasses, then all the people in the lineup should be of roughly the similar description. But what you've done, and that's good lineup practice, you don't want to put, a 4-foot-tall African-American man in the lineup if the person had said, no, it was a white person, 5'8". But if you have lots of similar people in the lineup, you've also increased the chance. Imagine implicitly a lineup is like a multiple choice test, except often the detectives conducting it don't remind the person, none of the above is an acceptable answer. If nobody really matches your memory, don't say yes to the one who just happens to be closest. But with very similar people, you can get these kinds of mistakes. And so we've been just looking in the lab at these kinds of problems too. So the basic problem with the trace-dependent theory is the memory trace is not the only thing that determines performance. The kind of cue you give a person and the match between the cue and the trace is what determines your confidence and your memory. So it's not just a trace-dependent process, but the type of retrieval cue that's given. Now, similarity is just one problem. I don't want to make you think it's the whole show, because it's not. There are many other problems in eyewitness testimony that I don't have time to talk about. The part of her talk Kathleen didn't have time to give, but I have a slide in here. We developed a procedure about 15 years ago that has been widely used in the psychological literature. We have people study lists of words like those at the bottom of this slide: bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, so forth and so on. these are 15 words that are all closely related to one another, but they're also associative related to a word that's not presented. The word in this case is sleep. So what we have is we tell people, give people these lists, tell them to recall them immediately afterwards in some cases. Quite frequently, in fact, in our initial experiments, almost 60% of the time, they recall sleep even though it wasn't in the list. It's strongly implied by the list, but not there. And we also did a recognition experiment where we asked people to recognize the words from the list. So they heard 16 lists, like that one I just showed you, all strongly associated words, and then we gave them a recognition test, like true-false test, if you want to think of it that way. But they would get words that were actually from the list, like awake. They would get words that were totally unrelated to anything in any of the lists. Say there were no animals, but tiger would be on the test. And then they were given these 16 critical lure words, the words that were implied by the list, like sleep, but weren't actually presented. And when they saw each word, we asked them to make a judgment. Was the word old? Had it been studied in one of the lists? Had they seen it or heard it? Or was it new? And then we asked them to give confidence ratings of these words. And the results were pretty instructive. I'll give you, here is, for the studied words, here how things played out. So you see for the studied words, 75% of the time, for those words that were really studied, people said they were sure it was old. They were sure it had been in the list. Another 11% of the time, they said it had probably been in the list. And 14% of the time, they thought it was new. For the unrelated lure words, it was exactly the opposite. Now, 80% of the time, they were sure it had not been in the list. So this is words like tiger that were unrelated to anything that were studied. 80% of the time, they were sure it hadn't been there. They were quite confident in its absence. Only 2% of the time did they actually make a mistake. Now, the critical question is what happens to those other words like sleep? Sleep technically was not in the list. It was not presented. It was a lure, or it is a lure. It's not a studied word. But what we found in that case, for those strongly implied words, that we found a very strong evidence for these kinds of false memories. I would argue this is the Mike Russell kind of false memory from the other day. Something semantically related, but not the right thing. So 58% of the time, they said, yes, I'm absolutely sure sleep was in the list. I'll never forget that word, like the face. 26% of the time, they said it was probably in the list. And so if you add up the sure and the probablys, you see actually the false alarm rate for these critical non-presented but very similar items is the 84% false recognition relative to 86% correct recognition for the studied items. So what we can see is, and this is, I mentioned, just one paradigm, but psychologists developed all kinds of paradigms to try to study this problem of high confidence false memories. I have a new research project going with a graduate student named Andy DeSoto, and there are all kinds of theories about why this confidence accuracy relation is all over the place. What we're trying to do, and I'm not going to have time to describe this in great detail, what we're trying to do is show in the same, a lot of people say, oh, it's different people. Some people have bad memories, some people have good memories, or it's materials. Faces just don't work. Faces are too confusable. People have, we don't think it's any of that. We think it's the problem is the types of methodologies that people have used, that often the methods people pick to examine the problem help determine the outcome. And so what Andy and I, with help from John Wickstead at UCSD, have been doing is try to create in one experimental setting positive, zero, and negative correlations between confidence and memory to show that all of these are possible and doesn't have anything to do, we're showing it with the same people, with the same materials, and all we're doing is analyzing the data in different ways to show that all of these relations are possible at once. We're right in the middle of this project. And what it involves is kind of extension of the kind of paradigm. We're using word lists for the moment, although we're going to switch to faces to make it a little bit more applicable to law later. We give people words from common categories. So here are, there are these norms of categories. So if you ask people to list all the birds they know, This is what happens if you ask American college students. They come up with a list like this. This is just rank ordering them by the order in which people tend to say them. What we do is to present, say, the ones in blue to our subjects: eagle, blue jay, hawk, crow, parrot, pigeon, and so forth. And we don't present the other ones. And half the people get the ones in yellow presented, half get the one in blue, and then we test people on everybody, on all of them. So this is a very difficult recognition test then. We've presented 10 plausible birds, we've left out 10 other plausible birds, and then at the time of test, people have to decide what they've studied and what they haven't. It's kind of like the case of seeing those 3 people earlier. So the recognition test, people get 120 of the studied words, 12 lists, 10 items per list, and then they get the 120 new items, the alternates. And for each item, parakeet say, people say whether it was old or new, and then there's a slider on the computer screen, and they move the slider to express their confidence. If they think parakeet was old, they might say it was old with 80% confidence. Now, these kinds of experiments produce very rich sets of data. I'm just going to show you 2 bits. I'll be fine. 2 bits of data here. This is what's called a calibration plot. All it does, it's a very simple plot. There's confidence. We just bin items by the confidence which people express them. That's on the bottom. So that's confidence. And that diagonal line shows if if confidence and accuracy were perfectly correlated, that's what you would get. And what you see is for the items that were actually studied, people are really pretty good. They're not right on the line, but they're very close to it. So if they say there was an 80% chance of their confidence, that they're 80% confident, well, they're a little bit, the points under the line show they're a little bit overconfident. But nonetheless, the line tracks for the studied items, the line tracks pretty well. But look at the lure items. The lure items these are the 10 items that were not presented in the list, all 10 birds. And people, I've looked at lots of calibration plots in my research and others, and you never see this, almost never see this kind of thing. Because now they are actually somewhat more accurate for the things they're the least confident in than for the things they're the most confident in. You have a slight negative slope here. At the top end, this is what people usually look at, where I just put the yellow circle. Here for the lure items that with 80 to 100% confidence, people are less than 75% accurate in saying that was a new item. So this expresses overconfidence at the right side, but to me it's also fascinating about the left side here. And we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. But at the left side here, you see that people are really pretty accurate. They're about 80% accurate on the far left side, but their confidence is terrible. They're failing to know. They're doing really well. Their accuracy is just great, but they have no confidence in what they're saying. They think they're just guessing, but yet they're quite accurate. And I think that's a very kind of interesting error too, one that I could come back and talk about in the discussion perhaps. Because I think actually this has huge legal implications too. In the eyewitness testimony area, everybody worries about false convictions, about you saw a lineup and you picked somebody out of it that who was not the actual criminal. Well, think of the other problem though for society. Suppose the big problem is you look at people who actually did commit the crime and you fail to recognize them. That lets, obviously the police can't take to trial if they think they've caught the right person and you can't identify them as the person who robbed you, then that person's going to go free. And so this kind of problem where where your confidence is, your accuracy and confidence are pretty low, that's also a problem for the legal system. One other way of looking at these data that I like is, suppose you just look at items for which confidence is 100%. These are the ones, remember the people could set their scale anywhere they wanted to. These are the ones for their utterly confident in, 100% confidence. For the studied items, they're quite accurate. 98% of the time, they're right. But for the lure items, the ones they express 100% confidence in, they're only accurate 66% of the time. Again, this big problem of similar things fooling people. So to conclude, what I've tried to show you is that illusions of remembering can be readily produced in the lab, just as they can, I'm convinced, in real life. It's just usually we don't recognize them in real life because there's no way for us to know about them. So people can remember events that never happened to them, and they can remember them with high confidence. Confidence and accuracy can be positively correlated, they can be negatively correlated, or they can have a zero correlation. That just because you're completely confident doesn't mean you're necessarily as accurate as you think you'll be. It's very hard to draw any blanket generalization. I think in the legal context, what this means is you shouldn't do what often happens in US courts. People shouldn't be convicted solely on the evidence of one eyewitness testimony. If there's no other evidence for the person, you've got to look at that as very suspect, although it happens all the time that people get convicted on the testimony of one highly competent witness. So I've indicated similarity is one big problem here. It's a very natural one, but there are many other problems that Kathleen alluded to in that quote by Loftus. There are many other problems that can contaminate an eyewitness's testimony, and similarity is just one problem, the tip of the iceberg, except I guess we shouldn't say that when we're on a boat. But okay, thank you very much.